They called it a strategic realignment. No warning, no pre-read. Just a last-minute calendar ping, ConFB strategic briefing. I thought it was about our international rollout, maybe a licensing bottleneck in Singapore. I walked in with a half-empty coffee and a few notes scribbled on the back of a napkin. Jasper was already seated. He didn't look up. Across from him sat Amita from HR, palms flat on the table like she'd practiced. No agenda, no laptop. Just one sheet of paper and the brittle smile of someone pretending this wasn't about to get ugly. I paused halfway to my seat. My gut already knew. "I'll keep this brief," Jasper said. He always started hard conversations that way, as if compression softened impact. "Today marks a necessary transition for the firm. Your role is being sunset, like a calendar reminder or a background service, quietly being retired." My breath caught, but I said nothing. My eyes drifted to the wall behind him, still showing the system I helped design. My code, my architecture, the digital arteries that fed every global contract. Effective immediately, Amita added. They slid a single page toward me. No offer to discuss, just a line for my signature and a checklist for returning company property. 11 years reduced to logistics. Jasper didn't look up. Not once. The man who once slept under a desk beside me eating cold ramen while we debugged the earliest version of our licensing framework, he wouldn't even meet my eyes. I picked up the box they'd prepared. Someone had even tucked my framed certificate inside the one from Geneva. The irony burned. I walked past desks I'd helped design, past the glass wall, still displaying the licensing metrics I created, past people who wouldn't look up. At my station, I opened the bottom drawer and took only one thing, a black leather notebook. Pages, worn tabs, bent corners softened by 1,000 hours of revision. It was older than some of our interns. By the time the elevator doors closed, my badge had already been deactivated. But deep inside that notebook, buried between sketches and encryption trees, was something they hadn't touched, because they didn't know it existed, and I hadn't written it for them. The apartment was still warm when I got home. A slant of winter sun reached across the hardwood floor, brushing the edges of my coffee table. I set the box down without ceremony. It thudded once too heavy for what little it held. Then I sat. Not out of grief. Not yet. Just stillness. The kind that follows a long breath you didn't know you were holding. I pulled the notebook into my lap. It opened easily, muscle memory guiding fingers across pages marked by caffeine and late nights. There, between a licensing diagram and a post-it that read, "Encrypt twice, authorize once," was the original draft of Clause 9.7. I wrote it during the second year, back when Helix Core was nothing more than a shared space above a bike repair shop, and a handful of us taking turns fixing the Wi-Fi. We didn't have a legal team then, just common sense and paranoia. And I had both. Clause 9.7 was a single paragraph, tucked into the International Patent Registration Schema. It stated in language dry enough to lull any reader that all global licensing actions require dual authorization, one corporate signature, one from the original architect listed on the patent, not a department head, not a project manager. The architect. No one pushed back. At the time, I was still brilliant and vital. They let me hard-code it into the compliance logic without a second thought. The board thought it sounded rigorous. The investors liked the word redundancy. They called it insurance. But I never wrote it for them. I wrote it for the moment I'd be erased. Back then, I hoped it would never be needed. I thought if we built slow-built right, no one would ever try to rip out the spine of what we'd made. But the moment Jasper wouldn't meet my eyes, I knew. The sunset wasn't an end. It was a rewrite. I closed the notebook. Light shifted on the floor. Somewhere down the hall, a radiator hissed like it was catching its breath. The code hadn't changed. The clause was still there. And legally, so was I. That night, I backed up the original file to a private drive I hadn't used in years. And then, without turning on the lights, I opened the email that had started it all. It started with a link and a Slack message, casual, unassuming, forwarded by a junior analyst who probably thought I'd already seen it. Investor Deck Series D FYI, no subject line, no warning. I clicked half distracted, thinking it was another boilerplate slide deck dressed up in corporate sheen. But on page 13, I stopped breathing. Unified Licensing Security, subtitle The Future of Medical AI Compliance. And beneath it, a diagram. My diagram. Not inspired by, not adapted. It was mine structure sequence, even the annotated examples. Every detail traced back to the white paper I wrote 3 years ago. A document I had never published. A document I shared with exactly 2 people. Jasper was one of them. I remembered writing it late one Sunday night, a soft storm tapping the window of my apartment, my second cup of tea gone cold beside the keyboard. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was documenting an idea that wouldn't leave me alone. Layered authorization, human-led failovers, geo-verified handshake encryption. It wasn't just technical, it was ethical. I emailed it to Jasper with a note. Too theoretical, be honest. He never replied. The next week, we were reassigned to different teams. I assumed it wasn't useful, but there it was, rebranded, recut, renamed. And now it was the linchpin pitch for a $160 million funding round. His words, his voice, my framework. I didn't forward it. I didn't confront him. I closed the tab, sat back, and let the silence wash over me. I'd always believed in the integrity of systems. If the structure was sound, you didn't need ego to hold it together. I built quietly, cleanly, and now I understood the cost. But I also understood something else. He didn't know how deep my design went. He used what he could see, but he never asked what I'd buried. That night, I began labeling old backups, checking metadata trails, building a private map of everything I had authored. Not for revenge, not yet, just to remember the shape of what was mine. And 3 weeks later, when his name appeared in my inbox again, asking for one small favor, I didn't respond right away. I printed the attachment and reached for a highlighter. The subject line was almost insultingly mundane. IP streamlining, quick signature needed. No urgency, no explanation. Just a PDF attachment and a single line from Jasper. Legals cleaning up the old filings. Just procedural. Mine signing when you have a sec. I stared at it for a long time. Most engineers wouldn't have looked twice. Maybe skimmed the header, seen the usual boilerplate about compliance revisions, and signed out of habit. But I wasn't most engineers. And I knew Jasper too well. His style was always clean, disarming, soft language masking sharp edges. So I printed it. Sat at my kitchen table with a highlighter and a black pen. Line by line, I worked through the document. The changes were subtle, clever. On page 7, tucked beneath an innocuous paragraph about international updates, was the kill shot, the replacement of Clause 9.7 with a centralized control provision. Effective immediately, all global licensing authority would be moved under executive jurisdiction. No secondary authorization required. No Rowena, no checks. Just one name, Jasper Lin. I didn't react. Didn't storm out. Didn't call him. Instead, I created 2 versions. One matched his nearly word for word, except it applied only to domestic operations. The other, untouched, preserved the original clause. Dual auth remained intact under WIPO's international framework. I signed the first. Submitted it through legal channels with the subject line, Domestic Compliance Update Finalized. They filed it without question. I kept the second unsigned offline dated, stored it in 3 places, a personal encrypted drive, a private cloud mirror, and a hard copy inside the same leather notebook I'd carried since the early days. From that moment on, every smile in the hallway, every praise in a meeting felt hollow. I knew what they were trying to do, what they thought they'd done, and how close they'd come to pulling it off. But they missed the clause. They missed the architect. And in their rush to erase me, they forgot to check if the system still needed my key. I didn't speak of it not to anyone, but I started watching, carefully, closely, because when someone prepares a clean exit, you have to wonder what kind of mess they're leaving behind. The first time I saw her, she was sketching on the whiteboard outside Lab 2. Calla Moret, 26, bright, eager, still new enough to believe executive meetings changed the world. She was diagramming the licensing node tree, my tree, with markers too thick for the details she was missing. From the hallway, I watched her walk through the flow logic like it was her own. She even used the same phrases I had written into our original documentation. Modular integrity, triple handshake, gateway tiered fallback indexing. Words I'd coined, concepts I'd fought to get implemented. But she didn't own them. Not really. She was reciting, not reasoning. I introduced myself politely as if I were the guest. She smiled wide, mentioned how fascinating it was to work on legacy architecture. That was the word she used, legacy. I was called into a meeting the following week. Jasper didn't make eye contact. Again. "We really value your expertise," he said, voice smooth as ever. "But we're looking at a shift towards strategic visioning. We think you'd be perfect in an elevated technical advisory role. No team, no roadmap, no code access, just a new title and a desk near the glass doors where the HVAC buzzed too loud for focus." I was now emeritus. The word sounded ceremonial. I told myself it was temporary, that transitions take time, that maybe they were still figuring things out. But then came the access removals, quiet, precise. First it was the dev sandbox, then the commit logs, then the regional API dashboards. When I asked EAT, they called it new compliance structuring. When I asked legal, they told me to talk to IT. Then one evening, a message from Priya. Sharp observant, still new enough to feel uncomfortable watching protocol slide, landed in my inbox. One line. Check the footnotes on Memo 12.4. I found it buried in a shared folder no one checked. At the bottom of page 6, in an appendix, few would ever read the truth my clearance tier was being downgraded. View only. Phase out within 90 days. They weren't just replacing me, they were dissolving me. Line by line, access by access. Until all that remained was my name on code, no one believed I still understood. So I started documenting. Not what they gave me, what they took. The notebook still smelled faintly of ink and dust when I unwrapped the elastic band and turned to the section I hadn't touched in years. The pages there were stiff from time, dog-eared from repetition. Tucked between two taped printouts was the function I'd written at 2:14 a.m. on a February night no one remembers but me. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't commented neatly or tagged with anything resembling protocol. But it was deliberate. The fallback clause. The final gate. I called it Force Revoke Protocol. Hidden in a side repository filed under a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know where to look. I'd written it when we were scaling faster than I was comfortable with. I didn't trust the board. I didn't trust the pace. So I left a line of defense buried inside the core licensing logic. If the system detected a revocation of original architectural rights without consent, if primary access was removed unilaterally, it would lock. Instantly. Globally. Every cross-border transaction would return a handshake error. Every renewal would fail authentication. The diagnostic suite would stall in place, and it could only be re-enabled by one biometric ID, mine. I hadn't told anyone, not legal, not Jasper, not even the engineering leads I trusted most. It wasn't about sabotage, it was about protection for the system, not for me, because I knew how power worked, how it shifted, how easy it was to rewrite credits and undo authorship without touching a line of code. The last time I tested the sequence was 2 years ago. Back then, everything still worked. That night, I opened my backup terminal and ran a silent diagnostic. I watched as the lines scrolled, flags, identifiers, triggers, and waited for the line that mattered. Primary deactivation override false secondary revocation lock, active reactivation permissions, architect origin. Only I leaned back in my chair and closed the lid slowly. The hum of the server room down the hall vibrated faintly through the floor, steady and cold. They thought they had silenced me. What they didn't understand was that I had already written the last word. All that remained was whether I'd use it. And 2 days later, I watched the system they thought they owned begin to shiver. The cursor blinked on the terminal like it was waiting for permission. I had already run the dry test, combed through the fallback script line. Byline confirmed the biometric lock was still bound to my credentials. There were no alarms, no sirens, just a command. One I wrote, one they forgot. I typed it slowly. Revoke secondary O, warn true. The system didn't resist. It simply accepted the command, then propagated it like a heartbeat. I watched the log output begin to pulse. First Singapore, then Brussels, then Sao Paulo. Each endpoint returning the same result. License handshake failed. Protocol lock initiated. By sunrise, 3 continents were frozen. Contracts stalled. Renewals timed out. Clients couldn't access diagnostic modules. Support queues backed up. Status pages offered vague apologies. Inside Helix Core, I imagined Jasper trying to explain a system glitch he didn't understand. Legal scrambling for answers. Compliance digging into the protocol list only to find a line of logic no one wrote, but everyone now depended on. They hadn't built around me. They'd built on top of me. And now that foundation was gone. I didn't send a message. I didn't write a memo. I brewed tea, folded laundry. Watched the light shift across my apartment wall as headlines started circulating. They wouldn't say my name. Not yet. But the absence was loud. And just before noon, my phone began to ring. It was the 3rd call I let ring before I picked up. No name on the screen. Just a number I didn't recognize but didn't need to. Rowena. His voice cracked at the edges, hoarse, flattened, missing its usual cadence. I didn't respond. It's Jasper. I know you don't owe me anything, but we need your help. Still, I said nothing. The silence stretched long enough to force him to fill it. The fallback. Clause 9.7. We found the lock trail this morning. Licensing is frozen across every global endpoint. Nothing's getting through. Not without your override. He paused like maybe he expected me to interrupt. I didn't. Just temporarily, until we can stabilize. I stared out the window at a man walking his dog across the street. Ordinary life continued indifferent to imploding infrastructures. You need my signature, I said quietly. Yes, he exhaled, just for access, just to restore continuity. I let the stillness settle between us before answering. I gave you my name once I said. You gave it back erased. He didn't argue. For once, there was no pivot, no placation. Only air. This could ruin us. No, Jasper, I said. You already did that. I'm just not stopping it. I ended the call. No fury, no flourish. And 10 minutes later, the headlines hit the financial feeds. The office was small, just a corner unit above a printing shop in South Boston. The walls were bare, the floors uneven, but the Wi-Fi worked and the windows faced east. That was enough. I didn't name it after myself, not exactly. Veil Systems felt cleaner. Less about ego, more about origin. Renee was the first to walk through the door. Same crooked smile, same overstuffed binder of international protocols. She dropped her bag on the desk without asking and said, "Took them long enough to realize the soul of the system was never in the code." Then came Dev, barely 26, still too idealistic to hide it. He brought no equipment, just a dozen questions, and a notebook already half full. I didn't need to assign him a title. He had one before he arrived builder. We didn't move fast. We moved right. We stripped the old architecture down to the logic trees and rebuilt from principle. Every agreement included a human-led override. Every line of encryption had an opt-out clause for clients. No more silence coded into the back end. We wrote not to scale, but to stand. The press called us a splinter firm, a rogue operation. But the first client didn't care. They sent one sentence. We want to work with the person who built the system, not the ones who buried it. When I signed the contract, there was no applause, just breath. And on the second morning, as the city stirred awake outside the window, Renee handed me a coffee and said, "You don't look like someone who broke anything." I smiled once, then turned back to the terminal, because we weren't fixing what was broken. We were writing what should have been written the first time. The memo wasn't signed, just a scanned document with internal notes, timestamps, and a line of commentary that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. Phase her out quietly. Worst case, we rewrite the back end and bury the rest under new branding. It reached the Ledger Tech Review first, then every major outlet by nightfall. The story wasn't framed as a glitch or even a legal oversight, it was betrayal. Calculated, systematic, and deliberate. The screenshots told the rest. By the next morning, board members were giving anonymous quotes. We were never shown the override clause. He downplayed her role in the core architecture. We assumed the transfer had been finalized. They hadn't just lost licensing, they lost credibility. Jasper tried to spin it, blamed shifting protocols, claimed the memo was misinterpreted. But the logs didn't lie. The system had run with the fallback clause intact for 3 years. No one had questioned it because they never bothered to look that far down. By week's end, 4 major clients terminated their contracts. A 5th went public with a statement that simply read, "We no longer trust the integrity of the infrastructure." Then came the vote. The board suspended Jasper at 4:13 p.m. on a Thursday. The press stopped calling it a glitch. They called it what it was, a collapse engineered not by an adversary, but by arrogance. I read the news while standing by the window of our new office, a mug of tea warming my hands. I didn't feel triumphant, just still. Dev walked in with a grin and held up his phone. "They figured it out," he said. I nodded once. Not because I wanted them to fall, but because I needed them to see what they'd built on sand. The signing ceremony in Geneva was quieter than I expected. No applause, no orchestra, just the rustle of linen paper and the soft hum of translators feeding words into dozens of languages. The hall overlooked the lake, still cold and impossibly clear. It reminded me of the hours I spent alone at my apartment window waiting for the fallout to settle. Now I stood at the end of a long table, the final name on the charter. My name, not as a placeholder or legacy credit, but as architect. Rowena Vale, founding signatory Vale Protocols. The letters shimmered in silver foil. The room stilled as I stepped forward to sign. My pen moved without hesitation. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The work was already there in the clauses, in the safeguards, in the space where something irreversible had finally been built with intention. Later, near the exit, a young woman with a press badge and nervous posture found me as I buttoned my coat. "You never said his name," she whispered. I looked at her, then past her to the lake. "I didn't have to," I said. "It was never about him." She nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. Back home, I placed the signed charter beside my original notebook. The pages that once held a failsafe now held a beginning. Nearby, a photo of Renee and Dev stood in a simple frame, 3 figures on a balcony. Coffee in hand, nothing urgent in their eyes. There was no plaque, no statue, just code clean and whole, living in systems I had shaped from silence. And outside, beyond the glass, the world moved forward finally on something built to last.